Many of our issues in America today can be traced back to one guy, one dude who cooked us all decades after his rise to prominence. And to answer your question, no, I'm not talking about David Bowie. As horrible of a crime as it is to normalize the mullet, his damage was at least just limited to that. No, instead, I'm talking about Ronald Reagan, whose damage was a bit more wide-reaching. As the 40th president of the United States, Ronald Reagan was arguably the single most destructive force in modern American history. But to understand just how hard he fucked America, it's important to understand who he was. Before Reagan became president, he was a Hollywood actor, very fitting for someone who wants to be an American politician. He starred in several movies and was even the president of the Screen Actors Guild before making his political pivot. Here's the funny part though, before he became the champion of small government and American hyper-individualism, he was actually an FBI informant. Yes, the whole time when he was the Screen Actors Guild president, and even prior to that, he was a fucking Fed, assigned to snitch on his fellow actors in Hollywood during the McCarthy era, reporting suspected communists to the FBI. So right off the bat, this guy was already just a slimy piece of shit who built his career on betrayal and deception. None of that mattered though, because Reagan had something more powerful than a consistent ideology or a solid moral framework. He had charm. The guy was very charismatic, well-spoken, knew how to act in front of a camera, and knew how to make Americans feel good about themselves. His whole brand was this nice, cheery, optimistic, and all-American kind of guy. You know, the America's the greatest country in the world. God bless America. God bless big corporations. You know, all that kind of stuff. And he'd do this act with a big smile on his face, and Americans ate it up. What most people didn't know is that behind this B-list Hollywood smile was a guy who had been a corporate shill for General Electric for 8 years before entering politics. From 1954 to 1962, Ronald Reagan hosted a TV show sponsored by General Electric, literally called General Electric Theater, I know, how creative, and went around the country giving speeches on behalf of corporate America, pushing anti-union, anti-regulation, and pro-business talking points. I mean, just think about how hilarious that is. Imagine seeing like Chris Pratt host a show sponsored by Amazon called like the Amazon Anthology, and he went around the country telling Amazon workers that they actually shouldn't mind the horrible conditions and should be happy to piss in bottles since they can't take bathroom breaks. Maybe you should go around and tell people how they need an Alexa in every fucking room of their house. Like, I think most people would see that and be like, wow, yeah, that is insane. But that's pretty much what Reagan did back then. Anyways though, Reagan was essentially a professional propaganda mouthpiece for big business before he was ever a politician. So when he eventually got into office and started doing everything corporations wanted, it was not a coincidence. It was literally what he had been paid to do for his entire adult life, fighting communism in the most scummy ways possible and being a paid stooge for wealthy corporations. Anyways though, after one of the most brutal landslide victories in American history, Reagan won the 1980 presidential election and immediately gets to work doing what his corporate backers paid him to do. His signature economic policy was something called supply-side economics, or as it's more commonly known as, trickle-down economics. The idea is pretty simple. Cut taxes massively for super rich people and corporations, deregulate industries, and the wealth will trickle down all over us working people. What could possibly go wrong with this? Reagan slashed the top income tax rate from 70% down to 28%. Let me put this into perspective. When Reagan took office, if you made over a certain amount, and keep in mind this only applied to the wealthiest of the wealthy, 70 cents of every dollar made past that threshold went to the government. Reagan cut that to 28 cents per dollar. Yes, that's less than half what it originally was. Corporate taxes got slashed as well, and to really hammer home whose side he was on, one of his first major acts as president was breaking the Air Traffic Controllers Union, or PATCO, when they went on strike in 1981 over the extremely ridiculous things like wanting higher pay, shorter work weeks, and improved equipment. He fired over 11,000 striking workers and banned them from federal service for life. It sent a very clear message to every corporation in America. I am completely cool with you crushing unions as you please. And so they did. Union membership in America dropped from 20% of the workforce in 1980 to roughly 10% by the time Reagan left office, and it has never recovered. Whenever unions weaken, wages weaken as well. That's not an opinion of mine. That is what extensive data has shown, and many studies have been done on this. For example, one by the Economic Policy Institute that found declining unionization translates to about $3,250 less annually for the median worker, as well as widening the inequality between high wage earners and middle wage earners. And as if slashing taxes for the wealthy wasn't enough, Reagan's SEC also legalized stock buybacks in 1982 through something called Rule 10b-18. Before this, buybacks were considered a form of stock market manipulation because that's exactly what the fuck it is. If you're unaware, stock buybacks are when a company uses its own profits to buy back its own shares rather than investing in workers, infrastructure, research, things like that. It artificially inflates the stock price, which directly benefits executives and shareholders and fucking over the workers who generated that money. After Reagan, they could just funnel money straight to shareholders and executives. In 1980 and prior, companies spent essentially nothing on buybacks. By 2018, S&P 500 companies spent over $800 billion on stock buybacks in a single year. Just think about that for a second. That's almost $1 trillion that should have been given back to workers, but instead it was stolen and used to make these rich fucks even richer. But like, the wealth was trickling down, right? It must have been trickling down everywhere. Nope, absolutely not. And the numbers are devastating. Between 1979 and 2018, the top 1% saw their income grow by 157%. The bottom 20% saw their income grow by just 24% over the same period. CEO pay in 1965 was roughly 20 times the average worker's salary. By 2020, it was about 351 times. The wealth gap that Reagan turbocharged has compounded every single year since 1981. The median American worker's wage, adjusted for inflation, is barely higher today than it was in 1979. Meanwhile, corporate profits have broken records pretty much every year. Trickle-down economics does not trickle down anywhere. It pulls at the top and stays there. Every serious economist will tell you this, but the idea never died because the people it actually works for, the wealthy and corporations, have enough money to peddle this propaganda forever. Reagan's other major project was privatization, the idea that the government should get out of providing services and let the private sector handle everything instead. This may sound reasonable to some at face value until you realize that private companies exist, obviously, to make a profit, not to serve people. And some things simply should not run for profit. Imagine if firefighters, police officers, libraries, things like that existed to have a profit motive instead of serving the people, and you had to buy like a monthly subscription so firefighters will save your house from fucking burning down. This would be disastrous, which is exactly why we don't do that. And education was similarly categorized as a service for the people that the government provided. When Reagan was governor of California in the late 60s, the University of California system was pretty much free. It was one of the best public university systems in the world, and any Californian could attend for almost nothing. Reagan ended that. He imposed tuition, cut state funding for higher education dramatically, and explicitly argued against free or affordable college. Here's the even more fucked up part. He didn't just want to cut costs. Reagan and his advisors made clear that part of the motivation was specifically to price out student protesters and minority students who were organizing on campuses like Berkeley. Reagan literally stated that he didn't want to subsidize intellectual curiosity. The numbers tell the story. In 1970, the average annual tuition at a 4-year public university was about $400. Roughly $3,000 in today's money. Today, the average is over $10,000 per year just for tuition. This doesn't include housing or books or other fees. Total student debt in America now exceeds $1.7 trillion. This crisis has a direct line back to Reagan deciding that an educated working class was a threat and systematically defunding the institutions that made education accessible. Just remember, whenever you hear people saying we can't afford free or affordable tuition in this country, that this wasn't even an issue like 50 years ago. It just wasn't a problem until Reagan. Then there's healthcare as well. Reagan gutted mental health funding and pushed the closure of mental health facilities across the country, sending patients out onto the streets with essentially no support infrastructure. The Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 cut federal mental health funding by 25%. The result was a massive and immediate increase in homelessness that began in the 1980s and has never been solved because we never rebuilt what Reagan destroyed. The homelessness problem was only worsened too by his disastrous economic policies. The number of psychiatric beds in America dropped from about 340 per 100,000 people in 1955 to under 30 per 100,000 today. Reagan's privatization agenda accelerated that decline greatly. So next time you wonder why there's so many homeless people in America, just remember good old Reagan is responsible for that. As if it couldn't get any worse than destroying the economy, union busting, deliberately defunding education and healthcare, things like that, it turns out that Reagan was also running an illegal arms trade out of the White House. To be quite honest, pretty normal for a president by American standards, at least nowadays. To understand the Iran-Contra affair, you have to understand the Cold War context. By the 80s, the US and Soviet Union had been in a global ideological standoff for decades at this point, each trying to install their friendly governments and block the other's influence around the world. In Nicaragua, for example, the Sandinistas had taken power in 1979. They were a left-wing revolutionary government that was friendly with Cuba, which was of course also Soviet aligned. These guys, with their own faults of course, overthrew a brutal and corrupt 45-year dictatorship of the Somoza family, ran a literacy campaign that dramatically raised literacy rates, expanded basic healthcare across the country, and redistributed land to poor peasant farmers. For America, and Reagan in specific, this was a nightmare. He could not have a successful communist or socialist country right in America's backyard. Following the domino theory, Reagan thought if Nicaragua became communist, so would all of the other countries around it. But Reagan had a problem, though. Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, which explicitly banned U.S. government funding to the Nicaraguan Contras, the right-wing death squad militia trying to overthrow the Sandinistas. So what did Reagan's people do? They found a loophole. A guy named Oliver North, a National Security Council staffer, created the scheme where the U.S. would sell weapons to Iran. Yes, Iran, as in the same Iran Reagan repeatedly and publicly called a state sponsor of terrorism, and then use the money from those weapons sold to illegally fund the Contras, selling weapons to a country you call terrorists so you can illegally fund literal terrorists in Nicaragua. It really doesn't get more American than that. This whole thing was exposed in 1986 and became one of the biggest political scandals in American history. The crazy part is, no one ever really was held accountable for it. Oliver North was convicted on 3 felony counts, but they were later overturned on a technicality, and he spent the decades after being celebrated as a figure in conservative media, regularly appearing on Fox News to this day, ironically, to advocate for war against Iran. Like, bro, you literally sold these guys fucking weapons illegally and got caught, and now you're trying to tell us that we have to bomb them and they are this great threat. Bro, you sold them the weapons. Like, you can't make this up. Reagan was pretty much able to pull a, well, I didn't know about it, and get away with it. Not without, of course, his reputation being affected, but for the most part, it seems people just kind of forgot about it. So why does any of this matter, though? It's because everything you're seeing now in American politics today is Reagan's legacy playing out to its logical conclusion. And I mean that pretty literally. Reagan was the guy who started MAGA before MAGA was a thing. Reagan's 1980 campaign slogan was, "Let's make America great again." Some jokes really just write themselves. Trump took this from Reagan using nostalgia politics and the idea that America was once ever great and we need to return to some fictitious golden era. The flag-waving patriotism used to distract people from policies that fucked them over. Trump's entire economic platform is Reaganomics on steroids. The 2017 Trump tax cuts were the single largest corporate tax cuts in American history, taking the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Same promise as Reagan. It'll trickle down all over you, I promise. And it obviously never did. Corporations used the savings primarily for stock buybacks, who would have fucking guessed. The deficit blew up under him, and working people saw little benefit in their lives. Trump has even gone further now with his big beautiful bill, which independent analysts have described as the largest upward transfer of wealth in American history, extending and expanding tax breaks for the wealthy and corporations, and paying for this by slashing things like Social Security, Medicaid, ACA subsidies, food stamps, student loan programs, and many other things that millions of working class Americans depend on. The people who voted for this are going to lose their healthcare so that billionaires can pay even less in taxes and enjoy maybe like a 5th super yacht or something. Reagan is definitely looking up at us from hell, shedding tears of joy watching all of this happen. On trade though, Trump and Reagan differ greatly. Reagan was staunchly in support of free trade and believed tariffs were a tax on American consumers because they are. Trump's sweeping tariffs proved this right. Prices went up for ordinary Americans. That revenue got collected, and chunks of it are now going back to these corporations after the Supreme Court ruled it illegal. Again, even though they differed on this, Ronald Reagan would be proud to see his orange disciple finding other ways to take money directly from working people's pockets and give it straight to corporations. Their disagreements on immigration are even starker. Ronald Reagan was famously very pro-immigrant, even granting amnesty to about 3 million undocumented immigrants, and called it the compassionate thing to do. A broken clock is right twice a day, and Reagan is a great example of this with tariffs and immigration, I guess. Trump built his entire identity around mass deportations, family separations, and disgusting violent rhetoric describing immigrants as vermin poisoning the blood of the country. It's kind of funny to think about, but Reagan would literally be considered too woke for the current Republican Party. I'm sure the establishment Dems would take him in with open arms though, so he wouldn't really be missing out on much. The difference between Reagan and Trump is packaging. Reagan convinced people he was their friend while picking their pockets. Trump just picks their pockets and points at brown people when people ask where their money went. Reagan proved that if you wrap policies that benefit the wealthy in enough patriotism and culture war anger, you can get working class people to cheer for pretty much anything, even if it just ruins their lives. Trump simply saw this and built his own cult around this framework. Anyways though, that about covers it all. Thank you guys very much for watching. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and let me know what you think in the comments below. Hope you guys have a great week, and I'll see you all in the next one.